So if we find ourselves seeking, if we're a seeker, if life has lived us into a seeker, meaning if we find this urge that is moving us through life in a way where we can see that some of the day or a lot of the day is about inquiry. If that's what's happening, then we can say, I'm a seeker. Seeking is happening. If that's the case, we should understand seeking a little more clearly than maybe we did yesterday. And one of the most important things that we should ask ourselves as a seeker is, what is it that I'm really looking for? Life has driven an urge, an interest, a movement in a direction that I can say, yes, I am a seeker. I am seeking. Seeking is happening. But what is it that I'm really seeking? And if we don't have a clear, concise answer that is not just a word answer, because sometimes we can think answers are just about words. You know, in school, sometimes in a test, we were told you won't get full marks just by getting the right answer. You need to be able to show that you understand how to get to that answer, what the answer means. And so we should ask ourselves this question, what am I really looking for? And not be willing to just have an answer that we repeat or an answer that sounds good, but an answer that when we think about the question and when we put the answer to the question, we feel, yes, this is a good answer to this question. I feel comfortable running with that as the answer to the question, and understand why it's a good answer to the question. What is it that I'm seeking? And so what I mean is, if we have the word enlightenment as the answer, I'm seeking enlightenment, that could easily qualify as a bad answer to that question, because we might think we have an answer to the question, but we don't really. Because I said, what is enlightenment? What is it relative to the seeker? And I'd also say, in practical terms, what is it? Like, meaning not some theoretical, oh, it means coming to know source or being one with God. Like, well, that's a sort of interesting theoretical answer. But is there an answer that applies that is a very pragmatic answer? And we might not even realize the difference between the two, because our concepts aren't necessarily understood as being conceptual answers to questions. And so we can have a conceptual answer that is a pragmatic answer, and we can have a conceptual answer that is theoretical. So if someone says, we need to, what are some of the things that we need to have if we're going to make our house self-sufficient? And one of the theoretical answers is food. Let's grow food. And it's sort of like, yes, it's not that it's a wrong answer, but it's not very practical. So someone says, well, let's talk about food, and let's talk about, okay, a vegetable patch. And these are that we can grow climate and in this part of the garden, and these are the specific vegetables that we're going to grow. And so then the answer starts being much more pragmatic, much more practical. And how are we going to get water to that part of the garden? Do we have a regular water supply that will be able to be used all the year round or when it's needed? So a practical answer in terms of what is it that we're looking for is, so what will we have after seeking that we didn't have before, assuming that we find what we're seeking? That's a good way of answering it practically. And it's also a question that we need an answer to, because it's really fundamental to the direction we head in seeking. If we don't know what we're seeking, we might go round in circles. It's also a question that we might not be able to come up with an answer for, because we could say, well, if I knew, it would mean I have it. And if I have it, then I wouldn't be seeking it. So as part of the thinking about this question, we also need to be honest and say, actually, maybe I don't know what I'm seeking. That might be not only half the problem, but it might be the something I need to acknowledge is I don't know because I don't have it, and that's why I'm seeking. And so if that's the case, then it's helpful to get some hints as to what the answer is, but then use those hints to verify it for yourself. Because if you don't, you'll say, oh yes, I'd love some hints, give me the answer. And then we lock the answer away as essentially something we know, whereas it might just be a belief, and it might be wrong. I labor this point because it does become the beacon in the night in our seeking. If we find ourselves getting lost, if we find ourselves getting frustrated, knowing the answer to this question is something that can anchor us. It can eliminate a lot of confusion. So it can also be one of the ways that suffering gets cut off, if we know the answer to this question, because so much of suffering is seeking for something different to the answer to the question. So much of our human suffering is seeking things that we're not really looking for, things that we think we're looking for, things that we think will satisfy us. And so if we know the answer of what we're really looking for, like if there's a true quest, and we know the answer of what we're looking for on this true quest, we might start to see that we keep getting dragged off the path because that's the ingrained habit to go seeking for something else. That is the suffering. And so we might end up realizing that liberation, or what we're looking for, is about getting onto the right path. And we keep getting dragged off it without even knowing it's this movement that drags us back onto the old path. And if we are clear, oh, that's what we are seeking on the old path, what we thought was valuable, and that's the old path. And in my seeking, in my spiritual seeking, I'm seeking this, and the thing that we will get the answer to. And so whenever we find suffering in place, we might realize, I can see in the suffering that I've switched over to seeking that again, seeking the old objective. And if that's realized and we're clear on what the new objective is, it can be the information that arises in the moment that takes us back onto the new path, or onto the spiritual seeking path. So I would say this is, one of the fundamentals that I would suggest to someone. Know this. Be clear on this. What is it that I'm really seeking? Which really means not what is it that you are actually seeking, because the body will move towards what it thinks it's seeking. And so if you ask the question, what is it that I'm seeking? And you look at what the body is looking for or what the mind is looking for, and you answer it, oh, I'm looking for a soulmate, or I'm looking for life to be fair and equal, and treat everyone equally. That might not be what you're actually looking for. So what does it mean? Because the question is, what am I looking for? What am I really looking for? To be, it's necessarily what you're looking for in this moment, because what you're looking for in this moment might be misguided. So it really means, what is it that I should be looking for? What is it that's available? What is it that I will have after liberation that I don't have before? What is it that Buddha had after liberation that he didn't have before? That's what seeking is all about. Because Buddha was a seeker that realized the search, that changed from being a seeker to having found what is available. And so I would say that the answer is happiness. The answer to that question, as a single word answer, is happiness. Spiritual seeking is about happiness for the human being. Now, before you get too upset by that question, thinking, no, happiness was what I was seeking before seeking started. Happiness is what the whole world is seeking for, and they're misguided. They shouldn't be seeking happiness. They should be seeking God. Let's hold up a little bit. There's a good reason that this is what I'm presenting, because when we become clear on this, it helps us. It becomes part of clarity on the seeking. We are seeking happiness. Let's well, if it doesn't resonate, then that's okay. You can find something that does. We are seeking happiness, and happiness for the human being is available in this life. I would phrase it that what Buddha found arising as what might be described his true nature, or Buddha consciousness, was happiness for the human being. The real happiness, the happiness that is available. So if we left it at that, that would sort of be a fail as an answer. It's the beginning of the answer. So we have to keep that as the beginning of the answer, because in the end, when we have all of the fleshed out stuff, we can just come back and say, oh, I'm seeking happiness. We can then use the word. But the word will mean something very specific to us once it's defined, once we go through the process. So we start with the end answer, happiness, and we say, if you just have the end answer, you don't really have a great answer. So why is it that we're seeking happiness, and yet all of the rest of humanity is also seeking happiness, and we're often told that that's the problem? Seeking happiness is the problem. And the reason being is because the way that humans have been developed, have grown, have evolved according to life, is to historically and traditionally and according to our makeup and design, initially seek happiness in the form of pleasure, happiness in the form of outcomes. That's the happiness that we think is available, happiness through outcomes. And so humans are seeking happiness through outcomes. And it turns out that that seeking happiness in outcomes is unhappiness, is seeking in the wrong direction, is seeking for something that isn't available. Sure, outcomes are available in every single moment of life. So outcomes are available. You can seek outcomes. You will get outcomes. Outcomes will be pleasure or pain. So you can seek pleasure. Pleasure is very much available. But if you seek pleasure and the avoidances of pain as your happiness, meaning thinking that that seeking for pleasure and pain is going to deliver you happiness, then you are bound to remain unhappy because happiness isn't available in that direction. Pleasure and pain is. And even if you are saying, well, I don't want the pain part, so I'm putting all my efforts into life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. So sure, you can seek for pleasure, 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 and you might find that your life does get, if it's destined, more pleasurable. But if that continues to be your focus, where you say, I am looking for a life that is pleasure, 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 because that will one day give me happiness, then happiness is not to be found there. And that attitude is the root of unhappiness. It is the root of not knowing oneself. It is not knowing oneself because if we think that our happiness is to be found somewhere where it isn't available and isn't to be found, it means we don't know ourselves because we wouldn't make that mistake. It's like saying, you know, a plant needs petrol to grow. So I'm going to water it with petrol every day. It's the wrong answer. And so it means we don't understand the plant. Now, the plant is an analogy here. It's something outside of ourselves. If we're seeking our happiness in the wrong direction, it means we don't know ourselves. So if the journey of seeking is in part coming to know ourselves truly, coming to connect with what we really are, ground into what we really are, if it is to have more clarity, then it makes sense that as soon as we become clear on what it is we're seeking, what it is that's available as happiness, like what is this happiness? In practical terms, what is this happiness? If it isn't happiness through pleasure, what is happiness? If we come to know the answer, then it means a part of our misunderstanding of ourselves has fallen away, and that's great. That's a big step forward. So happiness for the human being is available, but in a very unique way, not at all the way that the thinking mind would expect. And that's why on several different layers, when happiness does start to present, we say, it's not at all what I imagined. Because even when we start pointing in the right direction and our thinking imagines the concept of happiness, it's still not going to really get it until it sets in and it's like, oh, wow, I didn't expect it to take this form. Not at all what the thinking mind that is looking for more complete. I need things added in to make me more complete. And why is that? It's because the sense of self that has set in place feels uncomfortable. It inherently, by its nature, the sense of self, which we could say is the wrong sense of who we are, the not knowing ourselves fully. By default, that error, that belief system, which feels very concrete and lacking, uncomfortable. And so it sets off with a mission of gaining more stuff to make itself feel full. It makes sense. If there is a sense of lack, then the movement intuitively would be about then go and collect, go and get more, because you feel like there is lack. You feel like there is an uncomfortableness. And so, because that uncomfortableness is coming from a sense of lacking, seeking for something happens. And the seeking is for pleasure. And the deepest pleasure that we are attached to, and attached to means the pleasure we really believe will give me my happiness. That's what attached means. Attachment is the relationship to certain things that we are convinced will complete us, will remove the lack. So it means that there is a psychological desperation for those things, because we feel that that is what I depend on. My completeness, my happiness in this life depends on me getting those things. So that's what attachment refers to, where you are going to think that that item is so important, and then we crave it. And when it isn't there, we feel completely attacked on the level of self. When the item or the object or the content that we think is so important to us is taken away from us, it feels like someone is tearing part of us away, or depriving us from something. And it feels so uncomfortable. That's what attachment to outcome means. The belief that my sense of self depends on getting that which I don't have. And the deepest attachment we have, actually you could say it's the root of all other secondary attachments, is love. We are attached to love. Essentially because the false sense of self, the identity, feels it's not lovable, feels it has been discarded, that it has not received the love that it needs. And there are plenty of people that have grown up in situations where love from the other definitely wasn't provided. And when that happens, it can further intensify the craving for that, the sense that that is the problem. Because when the love isn't delivered, the attachment to outcomes gets fired up. Because as I said, if there's the attachment to love, thinking I need that to be complete, and then the other gives us the opposite, feels like I'm having what I need taken away even more. So then we feel like I need it even more. I'll crave it even more because I didn't get it. So there are plenty of human beings that haven't received love in life. And that can strengthen the sense that that is what's needed. They say, of course I feel like this because this is what my circumstance was. And so I'm sure that I feel like this because I didn't get the love that I needed to be complete. Now, it's not true. That's not where happiness for the human being is to be found. We are love, is what is sometimes said. We don't need love. Our true nature is love. If our true nature is love, it would make sense that love is not what is needed. It's like if your true nature was water, you can't say, well, I need water because I have no water. So our true nature is love. And we've forgotten our true nature. We've forgotten ourselves, which really means that this psychological identity has been put in place by life, which is the not knowing of ourself, the not knowing of ourself as love. And maybe that's why the craving for love is there. Maybe the the seeking is a seeking for oneself, and we are love. And because this self-identity, this me, this addition to the human being, or this characteristic of the human being has been put in place, it's now seeking that love, but it's seeking it in the wrong direction. And so this is where we're told you'll never find yourself in that direction. You'll never find happiness in that direction. You're seeking happiness where it simply can't be found. The love from the other is not the love that you're seeking. It's the love that you see is available. And so we say, that must be the love I'm seeking. And so the spiritual teachings are telling us you have to turn inward. Part of turning inward is to stop turning outward. That actually is someone, we might think, okay, I've heard about turning inward. Let me turn inward. Turning inward is really the ending of turning outward. Turning outward says, who I am needs love from out there. So half the suffering comes from not knowing oneself. So if we start to stop looking for love out there, understanding that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, and love from the other is an outcome. You get loved by the other if the other says nice things about you, if they treat you well, if they respect you, they care about you. That's what that's the love from the other. And non-love from the other is when they deliver the opposite to you. That's how it's felt anyway. That's what we know as love from the other is pleasant, and non-love from the other is pain. And so when the other doesn't deliver love, we can't be okay with that, because there's an attachment to it, because it's felt like that's who I am. And so if you deliver pain to me, if you deliver non-love to me, then that's personal. That's an attack on who I am. I need, let's say I need, red squares to be complete. And if someone takes red squares away from you, or gives you yellow squares, let's say I need red squares and I need all my black squares to be taken away. And if someone starts giving you black squares, it's like, no, that's making me less complete. Can you give me some red squares, please? That's what I need. I need red squares. I'll love you if you love me by giving me red squares, because that's who I am. And so if they take red squares away from you and give you black squares, it's personal. It's like, what are you doing? That's not, that's an attack on me. If you attack me, I'll have to hate you. It's just not optional. It's personal. So we can't let that slide. We can't forget about it, because it's personal. It would be an act of disrespect if we feel that it is so much who I am that I need red squares and I need the black squares taken away. And if someone starts taking my red squares away and adding in black squares, yes, we can't just let this go as if it's not important. It's personal. You're actually attacking who I am. The great news is that our sense of self that feels like it is lacking, feels like it needs things from outside to become complete, is a mistake. It's an error. It's not who we are. That's why it feels uncomfortable. And so to know ourself is to stop, is for that movement that is reinforcing the false sense of self to start getting interfered with, for the seeking for love from the other to start being interfered with. And how does that happen? That happens essentially when we start to see the ingrained movement for love from the other, when we see the insistence and the sense, the craving, and have a notion that that is the problem, that is the not knowing oneself. So it isn't actually about, I'm not talking about things that you have to go and do here. I'm not saying you have to change the way that you are. The teaching says you can't do that. Life has made you where you are, and life will change you and your movements. Being aware of them is a very passive doing. It's not really a doing. It's just seeing what has always been there, but now having a frame of reference that sees it for what it is. So that seeing is very passive. It's not something you have to go out and do. It's more something that will happen. If the red square craving is happening, in the past it was happening and we thought, yeah, this is me seeking for myself, seeking for completeness. And so it was happening, and it's allowed. It's like the police in the system are saying, yes, that's great driving. You can carry on doing that driving. We encourage that driving. And if a new set of rules gets understood, or not really set of rules, let's not put it that way. If it gets understood that driving is actually not good driving, that it needs to be stopped, it's the reason why there are a lot of accidents, then what previously was encouraged in the system and reinforced as being good, yes, we encourage that driving. Now there is just the seeing of it as, oh no, that driving, you don't need to police it. Remember, my analogies are always going to have their shortcomings. In this moment, I'm sort of saying, let's just notice it as, actually, that's not good driving. That's the sort of driving I thought was. Now it's become revealed that is what caused a lot of accidents. So the system is now seeing that movement for love as what it is. If we just have the intellectual concept that my not knowing myself is seeking for pleasure out there, and that the deepest attachment that the humans tend to have in their development is the seeking for love. Now, that's really quite conceptual until we start really recognizing that the concepts are pointing to a movement that happens really on a very pragmatic level, on a level of daily living. And as that movement starts to be seen, so if the concept just remains looking for pleasure out there, so pleasure is a very generic word, out there is sort of, yeah, well, maybe that'll happen next month out there. we might think of it like that. And love, seeking for love, it's also another generic word. As soon as it's seen that those concepts are talking about the movements that are happening right now, or in your daily life, and we start seeing that the seeking for love is seeking for the other to like us in the situation, the actual doing what they would like in order for them to like us, being particularly amenable and agreeing with what they say, for example, essentially maybe putting on a mask in order to get love from them. And so that's where it starts going deeper, when it's seen, there's the seeking for love. Seeking for love means attachment to outcome, means seeking one's completeness in pleasure and pain, seeking one's completeness in circumstance. The circumstance is, you know that, or they give you an opinion, the other, a friend of yours gives you an opinion, and you agree with it when you don't even really know anything on the subject, or maybe you don't even agree with it, but you say, I'm not going to tell them I don't agree with it. That's not going to help me get love from them. I'm going to tell them that it's a fantastic opinion they have. And if it comes up with fear of telling them that you disagree, the fear is a sign of exactly what I've said in a slightly different form. It's like I'm afraid to tell them I don't agree because they might not love me. And I'll go out of my way in a different situation. I'm quite happy to just be agreeable, because that's the strategy that we've set in place as to how to get the love that I need. So anyway, happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Happiness isn't to be found in love from the other. We are love, is one of the descriptions, and it's about knowing oneself, and then the sense of lack falls away. And when the sense of lack falls away, we say, I don't need love from the other. I'm very welcoming pleasure. I prefer pleasure from the other than pain from the other. And I will, when it's delivered, I will enjoy it. But I'm not going to mistake that as what I need in order to complete myself. That's only when there is this realization of oneself, and then the sense of lack falls away, the sense of needing that thing that we thought we needed. We find that we are that. It's like the beggar sitting on the treasure without remembering that they're sitting on the treasure, asking for some pennies. And once the turning inward, which is the realizing I have the treasure already, I am the treasure, then there's no need for the craving for the pennies in the same way that we craved for it before. And so what is this love really? Because I don't tend to use the word love very much in the teaching, because the word is misunderstood because of this very misunderstanding of self. The love that I'm speaking about, that we are, is a love of inclusivity, a love of not feeling like things in circumstance need to be not there on a fundamental level. So that means psychological embracing rather than resisting psychologically the diversity of life, the interconnected opposites, the duality of life. Now, that doesn't mean that we will have a preference to both the pleasure and pain. On a biological level, the body is always going to have a preference for pleasure, so it is going to move towards pleasure. Moving towards pleasure is not seeking happiness in outcomes. The seeking of happiness in outcomes is a psychological movement. It's psychological because it says, my sense of self is dependent on that. So psychology refers to thoughts about oneself. The biological movement towards a place that is out of the sun if it's really hot, that's a preference, and the body will always move towards its preferences if they're available. And if it's not available, the body doesn't turn the situation into a psychological uncomfortableness, unless that psychological identity is in place that says my sense of self is dependent on outcomes. So the psychological allowing life to be as it is love, because the opposite of it is hate. So if we aren't allowing life to be as it is on a psychological level, we are in psychological resistance with life, meaning a fight with the way life is because we feel it is an attack on who we are. And that means I hate life. I hate that aspect of life. And because that aspect of life, the whole, we really are saying, I hate life. So love, in the sense I'm using it, is the absence of hate. It means being comfortable with life as it is, being comfortable with the pain of life. So seeking is seeking for happiness. I haven't said this yet. The whole satsang is about what is it that we're really seeking. We are seeking happiness, but happiness is not available in the form of pleasure, in the form of outcomes. Happiness is available in the form of peace of mind. Being in love with life. Just to confuse things. Happiness is available in the form of unbroken being in love with life. Now, if we left it at that, I'm sure the imagination of human happiness, being in love with life, would include all sorts of feelings of bliss, all sorts of feelings of joy and excitement and feelings of love. And in fact, there's none of that in the description that I'm putting forward. Being in love with life means not being in resistance with life. So no positive feelings, just the absence of the resistance to life. See, this is why I don't use the word love, because if I talk about love, people are going to automatically assume it's the adding in of an experience, of a sense, of a form of pleasure. And it isn't. It's the end of the not loving life, which is resisting. And the resistance has an uncomfortable feeling to it. The resistance has, I hate life. Love is the absence of hate in this context. There is other forms of love that will, or other movements, human emotions, that will also be able to have the word love attributed to them. There are going to be emotional movements that we say, oh, this is a feeling of love. So the word love here obviously can be used in different or the word love can be used in different contexts. The context I'm speaking about is not the emotional love. That would be a pleasure, an emotional pleasure arising because of the circumstance. And we can have feelings of love towards life, a part of a gratitude and an awe. And that's part of the flow of life, part of the pleasures that are available in life, not only towards people, but towards just being alive. And that's very nice. It's enjoyable. And be grateful for that. It's part of the color palette. It's not the love that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis. Because happiness is available on a continuous, unbroken basis. So what is this happiness? It's happiness through peace of mind. What is peace of mind? Peace of mind is the end of suffering. What is suffering? Suffering in practical terms arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. We can say that when we feel the suffering, it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. All of those different forms of suffering are an uncomfortableness with oneself. Some of them, like blame, might seem like an uncomfortableness with the other. But really, when we rest in it, it's an uncomfortableness with ourselves. So suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself. And it's always got to do with one's attitude towards what has happened or what is happening or what might happen in the flow of life, in the circumstance of life. So it is guilt towards some actions that we might have carried out in the past, blame towards the actions that someone else delivered or had and delivered pain to us, pride for those outcomes that happened through our actions that were positive, and we say, look what I did. And so these are all attitudes, guilt, an attitude to those outcomes that were painful and happened because of my action, blame towards outcomes that were painful and happened because of the actions of the other, and pride towards those outcomes that were pleasurable and happened because of my actions. And then the worry is looking at the future with an attitude of saying the future might not turn out pleasurable, and that would be an attack on anxiety. And expectation is this picture, this mental picture that we form in our head and continue to play with over and over and over, and it fills our day. It can be a thinking about the future and how things need to turn out in order for us to be happy that completely covers up a connection to the present moment, which is where we find our true self. And so those are all different forms of psychological thinking that are always attitudinal and not circumstantial. So when the other acts a certain way and delivers pain to us, the pain, let's say they steal something from us, or they let us down in a way that we didn't expect, or they didn't do something they said they would do, all of those are circumstantial pain. Our blame towards them, which is attitudinal, the hatred towards them for what they did, is not circumstantial. It's attitudinal. And so the suffering is always attitudinal and not circumstantial. It's very important, if we're going to understand what I'm really looking for, to be able to see that life is broken down into two general layers: the flow of life, which is circumstance, and our attitude to the flow of life, which is attitudinal. And generally speaking, our attitude to the flow of life is one of attachment. And so these two layers are not readily noticeable as two layers. They appear as one experience of life. And you say, what do you mean? My hatred towards the other, my blame towards the other, is not circumstantial. Of course, it's circumstantial. They, smashed into my car and drove off. So my blame is circumstantial. No, it's your attitude to the circumstance. The circumstance is the fact that their car hit yours and then they drove off. That's the circumstance. And if the attitude of blame wasn't there, and they said, what do you mean the attitude of blame is not there? How can the attitude of blame not be there? They hit my car and they drove off. I said, well, let's just see. If the attitude of blame wasn't there, the circumstance would be there. The circumstance is you have a dented car and they're driving down the road. The attitude is something additional to the circumstance. So if you have a dented car and you're not blaming them, you still might have to pay $500 to have your insurance fix the car. So there's financial pain. So part of the circumstance is the financial pain. And it's a convenience. You might not be able to get to the appointment you were going to. So there are going to be a lot of circumstantial pleasure and pains, but your attitude of blame and hatred towards them, your attitude of guilt for parking outside the white line, for example, that is additional to the circumstantial pleasure or pain. And when all of this hasn't been investigated, it just arises as life. And we are sort of buffeted in a sort of washing machine of emotions and experience of life. And as distinctions start to become clearer to us, then we might start to see the difference between circumstance and attitude to circumstance. Now, none of this is telling you to change, to control. These are all descriptions. And the descriptions might allow you to see these distinctions. And that seeing is not something you have to set out at the beginning of the day and say, okay, today I'm going to see all of these distinctions. No, that's not what is being encouraged here. What's being encouraged is for a listening to the descriptions as descriptions. And then notice that a seeing might happen. A seeing of the circumstance versus the attitude to circumstance might spontaneously arise as part of the working mind in a particular moment. And realize that that's not you as a doer doing it, but rather the body-mind organism has been conditioned with the concepts that are being put forward. So make no mistake, the teaching is just new conditioning that can change the body-mind organism's up-to-date conditioning. And if it changes, a seeing of the difference between the circumstance and the attitude might happen. And you can't control that because you can't control how the new conditioning affects the up-to-date conditioning. And I can't control how the new conditioning affects the up-to-date conditioning. So the new conditioning is being thrown out. And how it affects the up-to-date conditioning, not in my control, not in your control. And the functioning in daily living tomorrow and the day after will happen according to the up-to-date conditioning. So that means the seeing of circumstance and seeing of the attitude towards circumstance will happen or it won't happen, depending on how the new conditioning lands and whether it becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning. So this idea, oh, I am going to do that, is running ahead, putting the cart before the horse, in a sense. It's like, no, you can't do that because that happening is dependent on the genes and up-to-date conditioning, in particular the up-to-date conditioning, being a certain way. Okay, let me do that. No, you can't do that. That happens when life throws the new concepts out, which are new conditioning, and then the up-to-date conditioning changes if it's destined to change. Just like if you throw, water bombs at the wall, they either burst or they don't burst. If they don't burst, the wall doesn't get wet. And you're not in control of whether it bursts or not. It bursts depending on the strength of the balloon and whether the balloon hits something sharp on the wall, whether the pressure at which the balloon hits the wall is strong enough to burst the balloon. So you can do your best, throw the balloon at the wall, do your best, but the outcome is not in your control. So I'm throwing the balloon at the wall, and whether I hit or not, whether the balloon bursts or not, is not in my control, and it's not in your control. So this is where, if we understand this, it's a great relief. It means, I don't have to do anything. Then we think, if I don't do it, well, nothing's going to happen. And the concept is, no one's ever been doing it. Life has always been happening as described. And so life happens that way. So there's no reason to be pessimistic about the seeking not being fruitful. It just means you don't need to worry about it. That doesn't mean if you don't do it, it won't happen. The whole point is it will happen. And when it happens, it's not your doing. And that too is an attitudinal recognition towards life. Because it is this attitude towards life where our suffering is to be found. And not only does that attitude include attachment to outcome, which is a not knowing who we are, and therefore seeking something that won't satisfy us, thinking it will satisfy us. Not only is it that, it's also the attitude that says, I am the doer. Whereas in fact, we are a very amazingly complex biological instrument created by life, conditioned by life, so programmed by life to function exactly the way that we function. We are not the doer, we are an instrument functioning. And so if we have the attitude of personal doership, that is another attitude of not knowing oneself. So what is it that we're really seeking? We can rephrase it and say, what is it that will be delivered? Because it's not, once again, we're not the doers, and so we don't achieve the outcome. We don't make the outcome happen. The outcome can happen. What is it that will be delivered by grace or by life or by God when the seeking is fruitful? Not because the seeker made it fruitful, but because life unfolded it in a fruitful way. What will be delivered is the end of suffering, peace of mind. So peace of mind is just the absence of the uncomfortable feeling towards self and the evil, attitudinal and not circumstantial. Peace of mind, happiness through peace of mind. And so when that sits in, we go, who would have thought that the happiness I was always looking for is a happiness in this form? And it's so fitting, it's so paradoxical, it's so unusual that more is less. That the happiness is a happiness simply because all the unhappiness, all the resistance falls away. And that unhappiness is not to do with circumstance. So if our destiny was to be handicapped, the handicappedness is part of circumstance. And it's going to have its pains. We're not going to be able to participate in certain activities that other people can participate in and get pleasure from. And it's got to do with our, that's our circumstance. But whether we feel happy or unhappy hasn't got to do with circumstance. It's got to do with this extra layer of psychological content, which becomes part of the daily experience or the momentary experience content, as to whether we feel uncomfortable with our lot in life, uncomfortable with ourselves, or whether we don't. And we've all seen examples of people in very unfortunate circumstance, and their attitude is inspiring. And the attitude, we might see the attitude in terms of positivity, and that's how it might stand out, because the person is extremely positive, and so it might seem like they have a positive thinking, a positive attitude. Whereas, let's say that was taken away, the expression of it was taken away. What someone else who is equally as happy, how they might exhibit it is just internally, they just don't have the negative, uncomfortable feeling. They don't need to be, spokespersons for happiness in life in a vibrant, positive thinking sort of way. That can be a part of a personality, and that personality type will experience pleasures that a quiet personality might not. So the positive thinking, you could say, is a form of pleasure on top of the peace of mind. But the real peace of mind is just the absence of the heavy story about oneself based on one's circumstance. The suffering, when it arises, the human suffering, is what we can call the psychological reaction in life. And the psychological reaction is this attitude towards circumstance. And within the circumstance, because the body with its biological preferences is part of the circumstance, then there is a biological reaction as well as the psychological reaction. And the biological reaction of pleasure or pain is always going to be there. So if it's a hot day, very hot day, and you're having to work out in the sun, then there is going to be the biological reaction of being overly hot and getting extra tired, maybe even dehydrated. And all of that is part of the biology. And you might even be irritable because of a biological tiredness. And that is all part of the circumstantial and biological reactions. The attitude, so the irritability might throw people, because irritability might seem like an attitude. If it's biological irritability, because the biological thresholds have been reduced because of tiredness or exhaustion or heat fatigue, then you might find that your biological threshold is lowered, and so there might be an inability to do as much work, and also a short-temperedness. You can also have a psychological irritability, and that really would be the case if it included blame as towards the other as the doer, and that blame tends to be carried on horizontally in time. So it holds on to the circumstance horizontally in time, when in fact the circumstance is finished. And so the biological reactions of pleasure and pain will be there. And then we have our attitude to the circumstance, our attitude to the biological reactions, which we can call psychological reactions. And both the biological reaction and the psychological reaction are based on our makeup, on the biological and psychological makeup. And the human being is not in control of that makeup. We've been through a factory, and we've been produced in the factory we can call life. The life factory has popped out all of these human beings, which are essentially the impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism or biological instrument. And that consciousness is making the biological instrument conscious, and life is being experienced from the perspective of that particular body-mind organism. And the biological instrument is what colors the experience of life. So the biological instrument is the instrument through which life is sensed and felt. And so that biological instrument has its preferences, and it has its personality, and it has its ways of functioning. And that is the experience of life. And that biological instrument has a psychological component for as long as that psychological component is kept in place by life. So life doesn't produce the biological instrument, spit it out, and then it remains unchanged. The biological instrument is essentially always in the factory, and the factory is life. So the biological instrument is continually being changed and upgraded. And so, in a sense, it is a new biological instrument in each moment, functioning according to its design. And so, if we see excitement happening, we can know that excitement is either a biological or a psychological movement of the human being. And that is not something that the human being is controlling, but rather that is a movement, an expression of the human being according to its design. So even if I've described enlightenment as the end of suffering, or what we're looking for is happiness, and happiness is peace of mind. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. It's not that we will achieve, but rather something that life will turn us into. Life will turn us into a biological instrument that is capable of continuous unbroken peace of mind, or it will have produced a biological instrument that is forced to relate to the flow of life with this psychological reaction, which is suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation, always attitudinal, and in practice, an uncomfortableness with oneself. So if that happens, we might start to see that suffering as a happening, not my doing, expression of the body-mind organism that is natural in a way. Not natural as in our true nature, because our true nature doesn't have those psychological reactions, but natural to the design of the body as life has it up to that point in time. And life can dissolve the psychological identity. And if it does that, then the psychological movement of suffering stops. And as it's dissolving the psychological identity, it doesn't dissolve it all in one go. It weakens it. And what is the psychological identity? It's the deeply ingrained misunderstanding that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. So that is the belief of attachment to outcomes, and the ingrained misunderstanding that I am the doer and the other is the doer. And so this description that I'm putting forward, that whatever happens, the suffering that arises, the biological reactions that arise, the pleasure, the pain, is all the functioning of the body-mind organism that life has designed, means that as the belief in personal doership gets less, the understanding sinks in deeper and deeper, any suffering that is happening will be witnessed and seen as a happening, not my doing. That's a sign that this description of non-doership, the description of non-doership is a realizing, oh, this body-mind organism that I know as who I am has been shaped, has been formed, has been created by life. And it's always functioning automatically. There's no pilot there that is driving the body-mind organism. It's sent out of the factory with a battery in it, operating. as the understanding goes deeper, a whole lot of energy in the system should release itself. And that energy is the load of guilt and blame that has built up over the past um, because of our attitude towards ourself and the other as the doers, and because of the attitude of attachment to outcomes. And as the process happens, that psychological structure is being dismantled. And as it dismantles, the energy that is the psychological identity is rebalancing itself um, amongst the remaining psychological identity. And that psychological identity is part of a bigger system, the biological instrument, the psychological identity. And so as these changes happen, we can start to feel a lot of changes on the body energetic level. And this suffering, this attitude towards life is very energetic. If you feel the blame, if you feel the shame, if you feel the anxiety, if you feel the attachment and the expectation, the craving, it's not just thought, it's much more tangible. It's what we could say an energetic movement. The human being is an energetic instrument. And so that's why when the end of suffering is there and it's referred to as an understanding, often it's said this is not an intellectual understanding, it's an experiential understanding, because the suffering is experiential, it's energetic. And the end of suffering is the end of that energetic movement, which means, in a sense, it's like a refinement or a changing of the frequency of the energy. And the suffering energy is dense and heavy and contracted. And what we find is as that dissolves, the energy that is left is a much less contracted, less dense, more spacious, less located, because it's less concentrated. And so the change is said to be not intellectual. It's an experiential change. And unless we see change in energy and our psychology, and understand that the psychology is based on up-to-date conditioning, and up-to-date conditioning really means beliefs, and beliefs are part of the intellect. Unless we see all of that, we'll say this shift has nothing to do with the intellect. And so on the one hand, it's important to understand what that means when we hear it. It's got nothing to do with the intellect. It means the change is felt on a visceral body, present moment. It's a change in the construct of the momentary experience, the end of the heaviness, the end of suffering. I say it has everything to do with change on the level of the body-mind organism, and specifically change on the psychological identity, which really, when we look at it, is beliefs, which is part of the intellect. Well, what in this teaching is referred to as the thinking mind, as opposed to the working mind part of the intellect. The working mind part of the intellect is the functional thinking, which is very necessary in life. It continues to be there. It doesn't create this dense, contracted sense of self, this uncomfortable sense of self that is forced to feel oppressed and affronted by life. So let's take some questions. Hello, Gayatri. Trey, I think you have to unmute yourself. Hmm. Peace of mind really ends up meaning that a whole lot of things that seemed important before lose their importance. That so much involvement in how things are turning out, how things should turn out, how the future is going to turn out, is something that we become much less involved in. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a biological involvement when it's necessary. But what we will find is that 80%, 90% of the thinking falls away because it was never biological and it felt like it was necessary. And when that identity falls away, it just doesn't feel necessary. And when something is necessary, we automatically find we deal with it. But the obsession to keep us involved in things falls away. And so there is a natural quietness, which might not be perceived because you'll still be functioning through the day, doing things. You might actually be active, getting jobs done, holding down a very ordinary job that has many tasks to get done in the day. The psychological noise that was multitasking so much time can have fallen away or will have fallen away. Hi, Gayatri.
Hi, am I here?
Yes, you are.
Sorry, my puppy is panting away.
No problem.
Yeah,
How are you today? Go ahead.
I'm very good. I'm sorry I didn't hear the whole talk because I was in the elevator, so I was in and out. But the question pretty much arose when you said something about love, because I mean today I kind of noticed that when I hear about awareness, that one is the awareness of what's going on. From that point of view, it seemed peaceful and calm to be able to disassociate a little bit with something. um, but sometimes I don't find that loving to like be disassociative or be a little cut off from something that doesn't feel to me like something that I would want to do. So that's a slight confusion. But then it's not bothersome now because it's not something so personal, like it's not heavy. I mean, there's a person that we're trying to coordinate something with them, but it seems to be uh, a little disturbing because it doesn't get done and it's repetitive, and it's like, all right, maybe I'll try to understand their point of view. But what I notice is momentarily there's like a slight disruption of peace in the moment. And it felt like, no, you need to put yourself there, because if there is a personal identification, then that's the one that's going to get trouble. So it's okay to keep putting yourself in it. But then it doesn't feel so personal right now. It feels like, okay, if I'm more to focus on the piece, it's okay to just sort of put it on block a little bit. and not, interact. Not out of any sort of anger, but then it still doesn't feel like 100% like it's a loving thing to do. So, yeah.
Well, what do you mean by loving?
Embracing of things the way that they are, and not being cut off from something just because it's a little chaotic.
Yeah, so the thing is that the teachings can sometimes be interpreted as a dissociation, like can lead to a dissociation where someone is repressing a response to a situation, and that's not really the teaching. Isn't to be unnatural. In fact, this teaching is really saying allow everything to be, because everything is happening. So it isn't telling you to be detached or to not get involved. It's saying that involvement is going to happen if that's how the body-mind organism is designed. And so can that be seen as a happening? So there isn't an instruction of, and if that is seen as a happening, that is loving, because it's the uninvolved seeing of it as a happening. So it isn't, if it feels like it isn't an embracing of life as it is, then that means it isn't the effortless non-involvement, but maybe a trying to control one's response, let's say. So this says you will respond, even if you respond in a very grumpy way, a very irritable way, very dismissive way, whatever it is, that response is going to happen, and see that as a happening. See that as the programming of the body-mind organism.
Could the response also just be to cut off? That could just be a happening as well, no?
Which part?
I'm saying one of the
there is
responses could be to just cut off from a person which is a little disturbing a little bit, but not disturbing like personally. It just like it disrupts the flow of things, like things are not getting done, and it just feels like, all right, one is tried and spoken. So ordinarily, to me, as my conditioning and the person that I am, that wouldn't be the thing that I would do. I wouldn't right away cut off and all. That's like pretty much extreme for me. I would try to understand and explain at the most, like you said, even go to the point of getting irritated if need be, but cutting off or like blocking
so why
would be the last step.
Why is cutting off happening?
Because when I was listening to her talk, it felt like preserving your peace is like the highest. Like my focus is right now to be more with the peace rather than purposely putting myself into situations that are unnecessarily disruptive, just to be just to be open.
I mean, the problem is often when we have these interactions, it sounds like there is someone trying to do something that I'm telling someone to do, which I'm not actually telling anyone to do, which really means it's heard as Roger telling you to preserve your peace. And that's exactly what I'm saying we can't do. The individual can't choose to be peaceful or suffer. The individual will function according to their design. So if the individual is going to function according to their design, that's the description I'm putting forward. How can I tell someone to be peaceful? isn't that a contradiction? I'm saying, you know, we're forced to function according to our design. So I'd like you to be peaceful.
Right. It wasn't an interpretation of what you are saying or of, you know, your teachings. It was just a general statement in terms of me being a little bit more detached from my interactions, like not as a forced detachment, but with a little bit of understanding that comes in, that I'm not necessarily just this body mind, and I just don't have to sort of yeah, so then it's not so upsetting. And then I felt that right now this opportunity, when we're indoors, I wanted to take that to more deepen in my sadhana, or so you know sadhana, right?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So instead of purposely, you know, because earlier I was just like, okay, open to it. And if it's coming, then, you know, but I mean, I'm still open to it. I'm just sort of shifting my focus to see if you say it's a happening, that's a little bit confusing to me, because it's a happening, then the direction, like I have two options to go left or right. If I go right, that's a happening too, right?
Yes. So which way am I telling you to go?
No, you're not telling me to go either way. You're saying do what comes naturally. I'm just asking that um, sometimes it's when it said it's a happening. Now I have a choice in front of me to continue talking to whatever extent I have this choice. You know, it's not the ultimate choice. I might still have to speak to them, and you know, to get things done. Um, so it's not even necessarily very practical, but I'm just saying that if I, in that moment, decide to limit my interaction there, to me, the way that I am, that doesn't naturally feel like my first go-to to cut off interactions, because for me that's like not something I would do.
So don't do it. I think that's that's a great sign. If it doesn't feel right, don't do it, because this is the teaching is saying in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do. It's like complete freedom. So
Right.
what would feel right?
So whatever would feel right is what I've done. I've spoken to them. I've tried to understand. I've tried to explain. We've gone, you know, like every day over it. Yeah, it's been done. And so from some understandings, when you listen to pointings, not just one way of seeing it, that, you know, I mean, I'm not saying it specifically that you've said this. It's just like something when one hears about awareness. That's why I said it was when I'm listening to the pointing about awareness, that awareness is just aware of whatever's going on, really. And it was just from that point of view that I felt, okay, I'm not sort of, my attention is going on this, as opposed to staying here, staying with the peace, or staying with, you know, this is coming from a little bit of understanding. It's not forced entirely, like, you know, but there is a little bit that comes that it's not upsetting me. It's just taking a look at it from like stepping 2 steps back and taking a look at it, that ordinarily for me, being cut off, even if it's for, you know, purely work purposes or not, it's not a personal relationship for me, even with a member of my staff or somebody, that's usually not something that I would do. But it's just coming with some understanding now that you don't necessarily have to keep putting yourself in situations that are clearly disruptive of peace. I mean, I'm still, I haven't drawn a complete line in the sand and said that, you know, I'm never going to interact with them. I'm just saying temporarily, that's never even been like my first option really in life, because it just felt to me as not being that loving. To cut off from somebody feels like not giving somebody a chance. But I
Yes,
see
but
that.
you know, it's like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? So
Yes.
is the saying. So once you've done what you can, and you've tried and they don't change, then you say, look, what more can I do? I've done what I can, and the outcome is not in my control. And if they're a staff member, you might actually have to say, I have to fire them. I have to ask them to leave, because they're not fulfilling their role, I've asked them to do it differently, and they don't do it differently. So I've done everything I can, and as the boss, I actually have a responsibility to the company, and so I now have to ask them to leave. That can be an understanding based on seeing I've done what I can, and the outcome wasn't in my control.
Right. But I mean that, there is this thing to give the benefit of the doubt, to keep trying to. I mean, it happens naturally a lot of times. Like, something might seem a particular way, and then you speak with somebody and you're like, okay, it didn't seem reasonable, but this is how they're seeing it. So, all right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know what more to say. I think if it feels like it's a move in the right direction, I think it's, when you say loving, I think you're mixing up two levels. There's like the biological pleasure, like I'll give them more pleasure by engaging with them or by humoring them, as in, or accepting their way of doing it. That's giving them pleasure. That's the circumstance. And the loving I'm talking about is attitudinally seeing everything as a happening, as part of life. So if you say it doesn't seem very loving to step back into the witnessing point of view, the witnessing point of view doesn't actually mean that Gayatri, the boss, the manager, doesn't continue to interact with the staff. It just means there's a witnessing of the body, mind, organism interacting with the staff, and the outcomes being whatever they are. So, the loving, and this is why I don't use the loving, the peace of mind is the non-resistance, the non-attitudinal resistance to what's happening. So if there is less attitudinal resistance, then I would say there's more love.
Attitudinal resistance, like it's like the resistance or is already there before I can think with about it. It's almost like a biological reaction there. I mean, it's not very reactive, but whatever is felt is just felt automatically on a biological level, and it's like, well, why is it even feeling this way? I don't know. I mean, then if I put
up-to-date conditioning.
Right. So this is what's a little bit. I'm sorry. I was going to say I was just going to say what's confusing is between happening and choice, because sometimes, like, you have to make a choice, and ultimately everything is a happening.
Yes, your choices are happening.
I see.
Your choice is a decision based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. There's no one making the choice. There's just your biological instrument making the choice. So the choices are happening according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Right. And where does awareness fit into this model of peace in daily living?
Awareness is that which is aware of the choice happening. Awareness is that which is aware of the biological reaction happening. Awareness is that which is aware of the speaking to the employee and them not getting it, or awareness is that which is aware of the employee continuing to function out of line with your wishes, or
Are we that awareness? Ultimately, am I awareness, or am I to identify with the body?
I think we're all people, and people have people are made up of layers. There's many layers to the person, and one of those layers is the consciousness layer. And the consciousness layer can be aware of all of the other layers. And so when we're resting specifically in the consciousness layer of the person, then it can feel like I am formless awareness. But really, I would say that that is a layer of the person. It is an aspect of the person, a dimension of the person. And that dimension can see all of the other automatic functioning layers of the person and be uninvolved in them.
Right. Thank you.
You seem to have dropped out.
I said thank you.
Oh, right. You're welcome, Gayatri. Thank
you.
Hi, Blake.
Hi. How are you?
Yes, very well. How are you?
Super.
Great.
I'm slow in a moment like this to know why I put my hand up in this moment. I wrote a few notes, and I'm going to see if they trigger me to try to speak more spontaneously, but I've had questions come over in the past few weeks that I've written down, and I think a lot of them were looking to correlate this teaching with other teachings I've experienced in the course of 20 years or more. So I found myself, well, let's see, I wrote this one down, which I almost felt I was comfortable with the answer that came up, but I wrote down, is it not likely that unbroken happiness is the same as abiding self-realization? However, unbroken happiness is a more relatable or practical, approachable appreciation of the seeking, whereas abiding self-realization, a little more distance can be taken by the body-mind organism as being just a continual returning of the attention to the sense of self.
Yes. Well, when you describe it as you did at the end, a continual returning of attention to the sense of self, at least it's become, it became quite practical again. Because if you say abiding self-realization without reframing it as you did in the end, it's like, oh, well, what is abiding self-realization? It's quite an abstract concept. Whereas happiness as peace of mind, or happiness in the form of continuous unbroken peace of mind, and continuous unbroken peace of mind is the end of suffering, and suffering is a movement of doership and attachment to outcome that can fall away. That's pretty pragmatic and describing a movement that we can be familiar with, the suffering arising, etc. So at least when you phrase it, and I do completely agree that they are the same, happiness is essentially the same as self-realization. And so where's the link between the end of suffering and attention abiding on the sense of self? And I would say that there's sort of two ends of a spectrum, two ends of a, not a spectrum, they're two ends of one dynamic, is that if attention is of self, meaning there is a groundedness in the formless aspect of the human being, then there is a direct knowing that my happiness isn't to be found out there. Because if there is a groundedness in one's sense of self, that is peace of mind. that is the end of seeking, that is knowing thyself in a way that isn't dependent on life being different. And so we tend to find suffering happening when we, I guess, get dragged out of that self. And then the psychological movement of seeking and blaming and all of that happens, which just doesn't happen when we're grounded in our sense of self. In our sense of self, it's like, I am is the direct knowing. I am, and circumstance is not so significant. Circumstance is going to be something or other. There's always going to be circumstance. And if attention is resting in itself, then the circumstance really is, what's the word, demoted to much less of a significance than when there isn't a resting in self. And so that's why that resting in self translates into a state of peace of mind, because seeking isn't there. Seeking and blaming and shame and seeking outcomes.
And so then there's suffering may come, and part of this BMO will, I'm sorry, BMO, I just came to shorter to type out than body, mind, organism. This BMO will go, oh no, not this again. Yeah. Nothing is getting through this thick head. But conversely, can sometimes take the suffering as bumpers for the blind man, meaning to impart a picture that it seems to be itself a pointer, the suffering. Not that I can necessarily figure out the better path, other than maybe just in the moment knowing that there's a confusion on some level, and thus maybe just sitting with the suffering and guarding against that ever delightful character that wants to figure it out, which gets so distracting that I maybe cannot just hear the plain and simple truth that's easy to grasp, but hard to get through all the noise of this figuring out dude. I don't know, that feels all right, I guess. But going, I highlighted this next sentence. So forgive me, some of this I'm reading because I don't remember it all in this moment. In the last teaching I was involved, I was told that the quickest way to self-realization is through consistent practice of having the highest priority toward being silence. And you've used the word silence, certainly not as much as this other teaching. I think I've come to take the word silence as meaning a dropping away of the sense of doership. Now that was never said, so now I'm mixing two teachings here together in my digestive system, and I'm thinking that if, well, no, I think experientially when I have attention in the direction of silence, which is in the direction of self-abidance, which seems to be in the direction of my true nature, which is not so much the narrator, is not a narrator, then that experience of silence would be the equivalent of the dropping of a sense of doership.
Perfect. Yes. When you say the sense of doership, I think that's more specifically, I would say the movement of suffering that includes in it the belief that you are the doer, and that suffering is the sense of doership, right? So it's psychological noise, psychological uncomfortableness, And I would, if that's what you mean by the sense of doership, which is a perfect word, sense of doership, as long as we understand it's the mental noise and the attitude towards what needs to be done and the resistance to life and all of that. If that's what you mean, then silence to me is exactly the silencing of that movement, the stopping, not you doing the stopping, but that movement coming to an end. And so dropping into silence is something, when the doership thinking is happening, a thought, in my case, I used to use I am used to arise automatically, which was just a reminder to drop into being. And then there was a stopping of the noise, and that was silence.
I may have spaced out on a sentence or two there, but I think the overall gut reaction was, yeah, that's I think what I'm meaning. But as you were saying it, I think the reason I dropped out a moment is because I had this sense that the whole business of doership happening, being taken personally, was stimulated by the misinterpretation of experience in life as being painful, and thus became suffering because it was taken personally. So I don't know, that's a dog chasing its tail. But I've got I've noticed that when something is happening in the environment in which I'm involved, let's say it happened recently, and I tried to write it down, but I missed too many pieces to make it coherent. My wife and daughter were fighting, and and the mental aspect started going in the future, so to speak, what this would lead to, what I was hearing from them, what this would lead to. And another part of training, the part of me that's worked, so to speak, as a healer, has taken it that where I let that arise within in a certain way, there is some effect on the outcome. In other words, I've put my hands on someone, felt pain, and felt it disappear in a matter of a moment. I mentioned that to you once before. Thus, there's that sense, and I can understand the confusion as to why I think I did it. I guess what I was going to say, but I don't know that there's a question in it, is that I've noticed that that's like a huge stumbling block for me to stay silent, is when something, so to speak, appearing almost catastrophic to how I would hope things are going to go, comes forward, and I can't seem to help myself from figuring it out. Maybe if there was any question, and it almost seems silly to ask it, but I guess all I can do is really ride that particular bumper car and let it scrape the heck out of this BMO, and just notice as much as you can, and notice all the narrating, chattering, and other attitudes that come up, and just continue to ride it.
Yes, there's nothing wrong with trying to fix a situation, but understand the outcome not in your control. So if we understand the outcome's not in our control, and understand that whether we fix it or not is not going to influence my sense of being, then if you do whatever happens in the moment, it's going to be done with a very much looser attitude. It's like, oh, well, this is what I'm drawn to do, and I know that whether it's successful or not is got nothing to do with who I am. Like, I will remain regardless of the outcome. And so essentially there's much more spontaneity in the body doing it, and your attitude to it is, well, let's see what happens.
Good. Noticing time here, skipping down to something that looks bolder in my written text, says psychological identity essentially be what others would call ego? Or
Yes.
do you experience those as differing terms? And also that ego is that which is an attachment to outcome. So that's the note I wrote. But my brain is wanting to ask you about something else my past teacher used to say. He used to say, P, that his experience in life had become one where he felt empty inside. And I took that phrase from him to mean that he had a sense of the dropping of doership. I was going to ask you a week or two ago if you relate to that. Do you feel a greater emptiness inside than perhaps you might have related to compared to some past period? Do you relate to that notion of having emptiness inside?
Yes, sure. The emptiness is what I described just before question time today, which is that the suffering is an energetic component in our experience. Like most of our experience is actually energetic, and the doership, the psychological self, has an energetic makeup that is contracted, that is heavy, that is dense, and that fills the experience essentially. So you can equate that fullness, not a good fullness, but that the opposite of emptiness. You can equate that with noise, and so emptiness can equate with silence. When the of doership and the psychological identity falls away, we can call that a move towards silence. And when that noise falls away, that noise is contracted, it's heavy, it's dense. And so the falling away of that equates to much more spaciousness, no location in a sense, which really is the end of the psychological me. So this psychological me seems to be very located because life is very personal. Life is related to this me entity. It's like, what does this mean about me? So there tends to be a very specific point of reference that life is being seen from. And when that dissolves, life is still seen from the perspective of the person, but inside the person is much less defined than it was before. And so the result is a sense of not being located anywhere. And that's not an absolute thing, because there also you can have a sense of being located spatially if there is a tension on the body. But you can go within the body and find the spaciousness. So I think what you're getting at in marrying the two teachings is, to me, it seems like the marrying you're doing is correct.
Well, then that might be good enough for now. I think that was the direction in trying to just bring teachings I'd spent years and years with. Because when I first heard these teachings, I went, oh man, this is totally off in left field versus where I had been. But the more I took it in and let it dance around with other, they seem to integrate better. So, okay.
And I think it's good what you're doing. I'd encourage others in question time to ask about how the two different teachings relate, because it does then mean that the one subject of peace of mind or liberation, enlightenment seeking, is answered from two different angles. So I'll finish off with just saying the doership and attachment is very much what traditionally is referred to as ego. However, in this teaching, the word ego is kept very separate from doership and attachment to outcome. The word ego in this teaching actually means the body-mind organism, the person. And it says we are the ego, we don't have an ego, we are the ego. There is an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. Then seeking happens, and if the seeking is fruitful, there is still an ego, but now the belief in doership and attachment to outcome has fallen away. And so there's no question about the ego trying to kill themselves, which is what happens when we hear about the end of, the dissolution of the ego. Then the seeker says, oh, I have to kill the ego, without realizing you can't kill yourself. So the word ego can be used differently in different teachings. In fact, it is. And it's useful to understand how it's used differently. So once again, in this teaching, ego means the person. We are the person, and the person can have the belief of personal doership and outcome causes the suffering. And that belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome can fall away. In another teaching, they'll talk about, I don't know, a person with an ego. And that the ego can dissolve. And so obviously in that case, it's just using a different word for doership and attachment to outcome.
I do appreciate that clarification. Yeah, I'm going to throw in one other mirroring. Sailor Bob Adamson and some that have taught in that direction, like a phrase, full stop. Full stop. Mm-hmm. Which at first threw me against a wall, perhaps like a Zen koan, going, what the F is a full stop? I mean, here I am, I'm moving, what's a full stop? But now, again, I guess I thought I somehow was supposed to bring about a full stop. I don't know, maybe just, the way of happiness involves a full stop, but again, in marrying some of the teachings here, full stop being the resulting silence, being the dropping away of, I don't know, I still like that word, sense of doership, as I had used it before, but any rate, yeah, that all feels an appropriate marriage of terms for me.
Very good. Yeah, thank you, Blake.
Thank you very much. Very grateful.